Welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Sarah Wong. For most of us here, as well as tourists, Hong Kong is well known for epitomizing the British influence on Chinese culture. But the rise of star swimmer Siobhan Haughey shed light on the Irishness of the Pearl of the Orient. In fact, Hong Kong and Ireland have links that go back nearly 200 years, with Irish roots and surnames deeply ingrained in our daily lives. David Costello, Consul General of Ireland to Hong Kong and Macau, joins us now. Sir, welcome to Talk the Walk. So good to see you.
Hi, Sarah. Delighted to be with you.
Now, as I mentioned, the understanding of Irish-Hong Kong ties for most Hong Kongers here begins with the rise of Siobhan Haughey and her incredible achievements at the Tokyo Olympics. We know that, of course, Siobhan was born in Hong Kong, but to an Irish father. And I wonder, how do Irish people back home view Siobhan through the lens of her ties with Hong Kong and the history and story between these two places?
Well, Siobhan's surname is very well known in Ireland because it's a deeply political family. Her granduncle was a former Taoiseach of Ireland. Taoiseach is the Irish word for Prime Minister. But she has an Irish father, but very much a Hong Kong mother. And so the community, first and foremost, sees Siobhan, and Siobhan sees herself as a Hong Konger, first and foremost. And we're delighted, and we were absolutely delighted during last summer to celebrate her success. And it does show, I mean, first of all, what a superbly international city Hong Kong is, and that the kind of mix, and this is evidence of it, that there's multiple heritages for many people. And Siobhan's Irish heritage was something that the Irish community here were deeply proud of. And we were delighted, as well as celebrating our own Olympic successes. We had 4 medalists in the Olympics last year, Ireland had. We were very proud to celebrate Hong Kong's medalists, and especially the achievements of Siobhan.
Do the Irish people consider Siobhan Haughey as a Irish success story as much as a Hong Kong one?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, Ireland has had a lot of difficulties over the number of years, particularly with Northern Ireland and the Troubles. Just when the handover was happening here in 1997, within 9 months of that date, the Good Friday Agreement was signed in Ireland, which brought peace to the island for the first time in a number of decades. And core to that agreement was this notion that identity doesn't need to be binary. And in an Ireland context, what the agreement said was that you can be Irish. If anybody born on the island of Ireland has a birthright to be Irish, to be British in Northern Ireland, or to be both. And so we don't see it as an either or. We see it very much as a Hong Kong and Irish success story, you know. But first and foremost, Siobhan trained here. She grew up here, went to school here. Her mum's from here, and it's so very much it's a Hong Kong story from her perspective and from our perspective. But we see stuff. We don't see stuff in a very binary way. It's not either or, you know. And this kind of identity is a multiple. It can be multiple ones, and something that the Irish kind of feel very comfortable with, that we can be Irish, and for many people in Northern Ireland who identify as British are comfortable identifying as both British and Irish. You know, it doesn't have to be the other.
I see. Now, David, you have said that Hong Kong has more in common with Ireland than maybe many of us here might realize. For example, the British multinational bank HSBC is headquartered in London, but its first chairperson, Frances Comley, is Irish. And have you ever felt that the Irishness in Hong Kong is to some extent obscured by British influence? And how does that make you feel about the identities of the Hong Kong people?
Well, what I've always said about Hong Kong is that no matter the sovereignty, you know, pre-97 it was British sovereignty, post-97 it's Chinese sovereignty. Nobody challenges that Hong Kong is a Chinese city. But first and foremost, an international city. It has been an international city from the early days of British colonial rule, and continues to be an international city to today. And that's core to the DNA of this particular city in China. And, you know, from the early days, the Irish were a key part of that story. We can trace, I'm sure there are earlier instances, but we actually trace the first Irish footsteps in Hong Kong to 1816. And that was a guy called George Staunton, who was on part of an embassy mission to Beijing at the time, and landed in Aberdeen. And if you go down to Aberdeen today, present-day Aberdeen, there's the Apley Chow Bridge, and underneath the Apley Chow Bridge is a small little river, runs behind along Wong Chuk Kang, behind the MTR, and it's called Staunton's Nullah. And that's the location of where the ship landed. And the same Staunton is the street in mid-levels, Staunton Street in Soho, is named after the same George Staunton, and we know that he landed in Hong Kong in 1816. And the Irish story has just flourished since then. In simple figures, for example, 9 of the first 15 governors were Irish. 5 of the 20 justices pre-97 were Irish. I have documented, I think, 30 streets or more that have Irish connections to those streets. And then many of the other kind of landmarks, for example, Kellett Peak and Gough Peak in Victoria Peak, and go across to Pottinger Peak near Wanchai. These are all Irish connections. And then more recently, I think, rather than having street names and landmarks named after the Irish story in the DNA of certain institutions is critical. You know, we're a matter of days away now from the installation of the new chief executive, and he will be the 5th chief executive. And interestingly, 2 of those 5 chief executives were educated by Irish priests. Both went to the YAM colleges, which is deeply, deeply Irish traditions there. And Donald Zhang will kind of, the 2nd chief executive, will be very clear in telling you the huge influence that Irish priests have had on his life. And there's many, many people here in Hong Kong that will talk about the Irish priests and the Irish brothers in the La Salle schools. And Irish nuns, particularly the Columban order, who took over the Maryknoll schools and became Marymount. So there's so many stories that I'll happily talk to you at length. In fact, I don't think the 20 minutes or so that we have today's interview is enough to detail all these things for you.
Yeah, of course. Well, that discussion could go on for hours, but today we're going to focus, let's switch gear and focus on present day community as well. Let's look at Hong Kong right now. I wonder how attractive is Hong Kong still for Irish businesses and investors during the period of COVID pandemic, and has that kind of attractiveness been dampened, for example, by strict COVID controls and on top of that, the changing political landscape, perhaps in a city?
Yeah, there's no doubt. I came here in 2018, and Hong Kong today is a very different Hong Kong to the Hong Kong I arrived in 2018. We've seen social unrest. We've seen the political and legal response to that social unrest, notably the national security law, and we've had to deal with a 2-year pandemic. And, you know, Hong Kong is making its own choices, and it's not for me to kind of criticize those choices. But certainly the implications of those choices on Irish companies coming, Irish companies staying have been significant. Ireland, for example, I was in Ireland in April. Ireland and Europe at this stage, the pandemic is over. It's no longer a story in Europe. Clearly, people living with it, but you know, we had clear phases in which we were managing the pandemic from March 2020. Phase 1 was we didn't know what we were dealing with, and it was important at all times to protect the vulnerable population. And so we had social distancing. We had people locked at home for extended periods of time, where they were only allowed out for an hour a day to walk within 2 kilometres of their front door. And then as cases mitigated and kind of lessened, there was a relaxation of those measures. But once vaccines became available, that became the strategy. And so social distancing was always about buying time to allow vaccines to take hold. And so the combination of a very, very high vaccine rate in Ireland, in which 100% of people over 70 are fully vaccinated. That is the vulnerable population that suffered really badly in 2020 in terms of people dying. But that population now is fully immunized through vaccines. And then we had a relatively high infection rate, which also gives further immune protection to the population as well, because once you've caught it, it gives you a degree of immunity. So it's never been in Europe, in Ireland, it's never been about the elimination of it. Quite early on, it was quite clear we could never eliminate COVID. It was always about living with it. And certainly the first 18 months to 2 years, it was always about buying time to vaccinate the population, protect the vulnerable. And now that we've done that, things like, Sarah, we stood down our national emergency team. You know, the CHP equivalent here has stopped in Ireland. We don't have an emergency advisory team. It's just the normal health services executive that is dealing with it. We don't report daily COVID numbers anymore. We have no quarantine on arrival. There's no requirement to do PCR tests on arrival. None of that is at play because there's no public health benefit to it anymore. And so the focus now is on economic recovery. And the focus is now on getting back to normality. And, you know, there's a lot of pressure here in this office, huge pressure on all our offices around the world for passport services as people return to traveling internationally, you know. So in that regard, Hong Kong is considerably out of line with its international competitors. And it does, you know, we can't tell people that there's no quarantine on arrival. There is, and that in itself just mitigates against people coming here to do business. So we've lost a huge number when the threat of compulsory testing was happening here in February. Huge number of people left. Hong Kong, these are all Hong Kongers, many of them living here for 20, 30, 40 years. And a lot of my good Hong Kong friends left, not just Irish people. This is not a transitory population issue. This was people who are committed to living here for the long term left. A lot of them are coming back at the moment. But until we lift the quarantine, until that goes, Hong Kong will still struggle to attract business interests. People are not interested in coming and spending a week in a hotel.
Oh, wow. We'll talk more about that, of course, and also the economic recovery of Hong Kong after the break. Todd will be back in a moment. Stay with us.